My name is Vivian McPeak. I'm the Executive Director of Seattle Hemp Fest, and I've been a peace and social justice activist in the University District in Seattle for about a little over 20 years. I grew up in California, but I went to high school at Ballard High in 1974 for, I think it was my sophomore year, and I really fell in love with Seattle and the culture here, and I returned in 1986, and I've been here ever since. I was raised partially by my grandparents. And my grandfather was senior national representative for the largest federal government labor union, the American Federation of Government Employees, AFL-CIO. And when I was 10 years old, my grandfather introduced me to Hubert Humphrey, the Vice President of the United States, a couple times, and President of the United Nations, and several senators. At 10 years old, I was an honorary member of several locals, and I had a pair of alligator shoes and a white dinner jacket and a double-breasted Edwardian suit. And I was basically really a little, I was basically a small, what's the word, establishment person, you know. So by the time I was 11, I kind of rejected the establishment and started rebelling. But those kind of seeds of political awareness were really ingrained in me. Also, we lived right next door to the Ambassador Hotel. And Robert Kennedy was assassinated while we lived there, just less than a block away from where we lived. And that was a big impact on me as well, because we were scheduled to actually go to meet, to be a part of that whole thing. I was going to go with my grandparents. And so that kind of early politicizing, plus growing up in the 60s also, I was 10 years old in 1968, had a huge impact on me. And I always wanted to hook in with the spirit of what was going on and be a part of what I saw as a solution, or maybe better, a small piece of positive change. I was a rock musician through most of the late 70s and the 80s, and a band that I was in Los Angeles broke up around early 1986, and I came back to Seattle basically to work for my dad, because I didn't have any work at that time. And I had been thinking, a couple things happened to me in the next year, and I'll try to encapsulate them. There was a gentleman who, I had a family and a wife and a child and everything, and we separated around this time. I ended up with all of this stuff. They went back to California, so I had toys and dishes and bedding and all this stuff that was really more than one guy, single guy needed. And about this time, I saw an article in the newspaper about a gentleman in Carnation, Washington, who had lost everything. His wife and 2 of his 4 children had been burned to death in a mobile home fire. And they were having a new start, and they just bought this mobile home, long story. And there was a picture of him in the hospital. He was all burnt and bandaged up, and he had one of his remaining kids on his belly. And I thought, wow, I have all this stuff, and there's this guy needs, you know, they were saying in the newspaper he's making a fresh start. He lost everything he owned, and he had to raise his 2 kids. So I thought, you know, what if I hooked up with this guy and I gave him all this stuff that I have? It seemed like it'd be a positive use. So I called the number in the newspaper, and it was the wrong number. And I spent a couple days and about 20 calls. I called everybody I could think of, you know, the fire department and the Harborview burn unit. And eventually I tracked down the right number for the woman that had been doing this donation drive. And at the time I had a purple mullet, rock mullet, bright purple, eyeliner, dangly earrings, black leather jacket, black, you know, cowboy boots, stretched jeans. I mean, I looked totally like an 80s glam rocker would. And I packed all this stuff. I actually got a hold of all my friends, and I had everybody donate everything they could, and I talked to the local thrift stores, and I got stuff donated, you know, until I had all kinds of stuff. And I drove down to Carnation to meet this guy one night and knocked on the door, and the guy opened the door, and he was a good old boy. He was a logger, and he started crying. And he was just blown away that somebody that looked like me, and he told me, he says, I wouldn't have spit on somebody who looked like you 5 minutes ago. And I was the only person that donated anything because they had the wrong number in the paper and nobody else went to that effort. So it really profoundly changed me, that experience of, and they brought me in, they gave me cookies and milk, and basically I never would have been in their home, they never would have even associated with somebody like me. And And so I realized at that time that there were a lot of alternative culture people who would like to, or would benefit from community service and from being involved in community service, and that there really was no vehicle for young music culture, especially alternative culture people, to do something like that. So this really inspired me to start thinking about what an organization would be like that could attract street-level people to doing something positive and build self-esteem, give them maybe hopefully some form of job training, some skills interacting with other people and communication skills and stuff like that, and basically just a sense of being, of self-worth. I had really never been to the U District, and my girlfriend at that time brought me to the U District, and I was totally blown away by the culture that was here in the 80s, in the late 80s, and the grunge movement was in full bloom, as I said, and the poles on the Ave were this big with posters, with band posters and rock posters, and it looked to me like Telegraph Avenue looked in the 60s. So I realized really quickly, this is the spot. If I'm going to do this thing I want to do, this is the part of town I should do it in. I gave notice at my job, and one of the guys that was dishwashing for me says, I was telling the guys I worked with this crazy scheme that I had, and he says, well, you know, I live in this little shack on 45th, not far from the Ave, and I'm looking for a roommate. And so I ended up moving in with him in this dingy little heroin shack, they called it. And not long after that, I stumbled across this place called The Last Exit on Brooklyn. It was the oldest coffee house in Seattle. And it was absolutely an institution in the university. It was an anchor of community in the university district. I lucked out because I got hired there immediately that first time I walked into the place. And it really was a blessing for me because that was my office, that was my operating center. And I was there every day working, and basically everybody who was kind of involved in the scene in Seattle, and a lot of overlapping cultural circles, at some point blew through The Last Exit on Brooklyn. So I started this group called the Seattle Peace Heathens Community Action Group, and it started off with just a piece of paper that was our creed, our kind of statement to the world. And I started to get a lot of phone calls. And so, long story short, we ended up having these meetings. We had potluck meetings that went on for years in Seattle. In fact, they haven't stopped because the Hemp Fest picked them up. So it's been about 20 years consecutively we've been having these summer potlucks in the park and stuff. In those days, anyone was welcome. And we would feed anybody who came and showed up as a community service, and also maybe as a little bit of a attraction to come and hear what we had to say.